Before there was a single day, there was no time to count one n. Before there was land, there was no ground to stand on to watch it form. Genesis opens on a scene that is almost impossible to picture, because it is a scene with nothing in it at all. No light, no shape, no sound, only the Spirit of God moving over the face of the deep. The Hebrew phrase for what the earth looked like in that moment is tohu wa bohu, formless and void, a phrase so strange that translators have never fully agreed on how to render it in English. It does not simply mean empty. It means unformed, unshaped, waiting. And into that waiting, God speaks. Consider, for a moment, what this opening actually asks you to imagine. Every other origin story you have ever encountered begins with something already present, some raw material, some pre-existing substance the gods merely rearrange. Genesis begins with a canvas so empty that even the word canvas overstates what is there. There is no material. There is no audience. There is nothing except the Spirit of God, hovering, and the sound of a voice about to speak into absolute silence. This is worth pausing on, because it is easy to read past it. The very first recorded action God takes is not a hand shaping clay. It is a voice. Let there be light, he says, and there is light. In the Hebrew, the verb used for what God does throughout this chapter is bara, to create, and it is a word the Old Testament reserves for God alone. Human beings can build, form, shape, assemble. Only God, in this account, can bara. Something appears that was never there before, and it appears simply because he speaks it. To understand how remarkable this is, it helps to know what other ancient peoples believed about how the world began. The Babylonians told a very different story, recorded on clay tablets in a text scholars now call the Enuma Elish. In that account, the world begins not with a calm, ordered voice, but with violence. The god Marduk defeats a chaos dragon named Tiamat in battle, and splits her corpse in half to form the sky and the sea. Creation, in that telling, is the leftover wreckage of a war between gods. Genesis was written into a world full of stories like that one. And it begins, instead, with a single, unhurried voice speaking order into nothing, with no rival, no struggle, and no violence at all. God calls the light day, and the darkness he calls night, and evening comes, and morning follows it, and that is the first day of a universe that did not exist 24 hours earlier. Notice the order in that closing formula, because it repeats 6 times across this chapter and it is easy to miss. Evening, then morning. Not morning, then evening. In the calendar this account eventually gives rise to. A day begins at sundown, not at sunrise. A convention still observed in Jewish timekeeping today, where a new Sabbath begins Friday at dusk rather than Saturday at dawn. The rhythm of an entire nation's calendar, in other words, is already quietly embedded in the very first day of its scripture, centuries before that nation exists. On the second day, God turns his attention to the waters themselves. Genesis describes an expanse being placed in the midst of the waters, separating the waters above from the waters below. He calls this expanse heaven, or in Hebrew, shamayim, the sky. Whatever exact picture the ancient audience had in mind, the theological point is unmistakable. Chaos is being divided, ordered, and named. Nothing in this world stays formless for long once God begins to speak over it. It is worth noting that day 2 is the only day in this entire chapter that does not end with the phrase, "And God saw that it was good." Scholars have debated why for centuries, and no explanation is universally agreed upon, but one reading fits the chapter's larger pattern well. The work of separating sky from sea is not finished until the waters below are themselves gathered and given boundaries on day 3. The blessing, in other words, is withheld for a moment, not because anything has gone wrong, but because the sentence this account is building has not yet reached its full stop. On the third day, God gathers the waters under the sky into one place, and dry land appears for the first time. He calls the dry land earth, and the waters he calls seas. And then, the moment there is solid ground to receive it, he speaks again, and the ground brings forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, each according to its own kind. This is the first time a phrase appears that will repeat 7 times before this chapter ends. God saw that it was good. Hold on to that phrase, because it is not decoration. It is a refrain, and like any refrain in a piece of music, it is meant to build. Light. Good. Land and seas. Good. Vegetation. Good. Each day adds another movement to something that is clearly being composed, not merely assembled. If the patient, ordered structure of this account is new to you, the way each day builds deliberately on the one before it. That is exactly the kind of detail this channel exists to uncover, one book of the Bible at a time. Before moving into the second half of this account, it is worth noticing something about its architecture that is easy to miss on a casual reading. The 6 days of creation are not simply 6 unrelated events strung together in sequence. They form 2 matching columns of 3, and each day in the second column fills the space the corresponding day in the first column created. On day 1, God separates light from darkness. On day 4, he fills that light with the sun, moon, and stars that will govern it. On day 2, God separates sky from sea. On day 5, he fills the sky with birds and the sea with swimming creatures. On day 3, God separates land from water and clothes the land in vegetation. On day 6, he fills that land with animals, and finally with the man and woman who will govern it. This is not an accident of storytelling. It is architecture, a builder first constructing the rooms of a house, and then, one by one, furnishing each room he has made. Whoever composed this account was not simply recording events. They were composing something closer to poetry, with a structure precise enough to reward careful attention thousands of years later. On the 4th day, God places 2 great lights in the expanse of the sky, a greater light to govern the day, and a lesser light to govern the night, and the stars as well. It is worth noticing what this day is not doing. In the world surrounding ancient Israel, the sun and moon were themselves worshipped as gods. Egypt worshipped the sun as Ra. Babylon had its own moon god, Sin. Genesis, quietly and without argument, demotes both of them to the status of objects, lamps, hung in the sky by the God who made them, given a function and nothing more. The sun does not rule Israel's God. It reports to him. On the 5th day, life enters the water and the sky at the same time. God says, "Let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth." Great sea creatures appear. The Hebrew word used here, Tananim, is the same word elsewhere applied to sea monsters and dragons in ancient Near Eastern literature, the very kind of chaos creature that Marduk had to defeat in battle to make the world. Genesis does not have God fighting these creatures for supremacy. He simply makes them, blesses them, and moves on to the next day. What other cultures treated as cosmic threats, Genesis treats as pets. And now we arrive at the 6th day, and everything the chapter has been building toward. God makes the land creatures, livestock, creeping things, wild animals of every kind, and then, for the first and only time in this entire account, the language shifts. Every other creative act in Genesis chapter 1 has been introduced with the simple phrase, "And God said." But before making the final creature of the 6th day, the text records something different. "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." A plural pronoun, spoken by the one God, followed by an act unlike any before it. Here is where the contrast with Babylon becomes almost impossible to ignore. In the Enuma Elish, human beings are created almost as an afterthought, out of the blood of a defeated, executed god named Kingu, and their entire purpose is to perform the manual labor the gods no longer wish to do themselves. Humanity, in that account, exists to serve the gods' convenience. Genesis says something radically different. The Hebrew word for image here is selim, the same word used elsewhere for a carved statue representing a king's authority in a territory he could not personally occupy. Human beings, in Genesis, are not slave labor created from a dead god's blood. They are living representatives, placed in creation to reflect the authority and character of the God who made them. Notice, too, what the text says next. "So God created man in his own image, in the image of God he created him, male and female he created them." In a world where nearly every surrounding culture assigned greater dignity and value to men over women, Genesis places both, without qualification, inside the single most exalted category the chapter has offered, the image of God itself. Neither is described as an afterthought to the other. Both stand, together, as the crown of 6 days of ordered, deliberate work. And then God blesses them, not curses them, not conscripts them, blesses them, and gives them dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and every living thing that moves on the earth. Stewardship, not servitude. Authority, not slavery. Whatever else this chapter is doing, It is answering a question the ancient world had already asked in a very different way. What are human beings for? And Genesis answers it by making humanity the one creature in the entire account made in God's own image. Then comes the seventh phrase of the refrain, and it is not simply good this time. God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. If there is a single sentence in this whole chapter worth returning to later, this is likely the one. Very good, spoken not over the sun, not over the sea creatures, but over the completed whole, including the man and woman standing within it. On the seventh day, God rests. Not because he is weary. Nothing in the text suggests fatigue, but because the work is finished, and rest itself is being built into the rhythm of creation from its very first week. The Hebrew word for this rest, Shabbat, becomes the root of an entire institution that will shape Israel's calendar for the rest of its history. Before there is a nation to keep a Sabbath, there is a God who keeps one first, and invites everything he has made to keep it alongside him. Centuries later, when God gives Israel the 10 Commandments at Sinai, the reasoning behind the fourth commandment reaches all the way back to this exact chapter. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. The command reads, "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day." Israel is not being asked to invent a new religious practice out of nothing. It is being asked to imitate a rhythm God himself established before Israel existed, before the Exodus from Egypt, before Abraham, before anything else in the biblical story had even begun. Rest, in other words, is not a reward reserved for after the work is finally done. It is written into the architecture of the world from its very first week, offered as a gift before it is ever commanded as a law. It is worth stepping back now and asking what this entire account was actually written to do. Genesis chapter 1 was almost certainly composed for a people who had spent generations surrounded by cultures whose gods fought each other, grew tired, needed human servants, and treated chaos as something that had to be violently subdued. Traditionally attributed to Moses, and likely first received by a generation of Israelites who had only recently left Egypt, this chapter reads less like an ancient science lesson and more like a quiet, systematic rebuttal of every competing origin story circulating in its world. A people who had spent 400 years surrounded by the gods of Egypt, and who were about to spend 40 more years surrounded by the gods of Canaan, needed to know, in the clearest possible terms, that the sun above them, the sea beside them, and even the great sea creatures beneath them were not rival powers to be feared or appeased. They were simply things their God had made, on his own schedule, by his own voice, without a struggle. Where Babylon told a story of violence, Genesis tells a story of speech. Where other nations worship the sun and moon, Genesis hangs them in the sky like lamps. Where other cultures made humanity slaves to divine convenience, Genesis makes humanity the image-bearers of the one God who made everything else simply by speaking. There is one more echo worth hearing before this account closes, and it comes from far outside the book of Genesis itself. Centuries later, the opening line of John's Gospel begins with words that deliberately mirror the very first verse of this chapter. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John is not writing poetry for its own sake. He is telling you that the same voice that spoke light into formless darkness on the first page of the Bible is the same voice that later took on flesh and walked among the very creation it once called into being. If tracing the architecture hidden inside familiar chapters like this one is the kind of study you want more of, this channel walks through a different passage this way every week. So here is what this account leaves you with, once you set it beside everything else the ancient world believed about where the universe came from. First, creation, in the Bible's own telling, was never a struggle. No God here fights another God for the right to make a world. There is one voice, unhurried, and everything that exists comes into being simply because that voice spoke. Second, nothing in this universe was ever meant to rule you the way the ancient world believed the sun, moon, and sea monsters ruled human life. Every one of those things, in Genesis, is simply something God made, placed, named, and given a function, and nothing more. And third, the one worth carrying with you longest. You were never created as an afterthought, and you were never created to be a slave to something else's convenience. Whatever else this account is doing across its 7 days, it insists that the very last thing God made in that first week was made in his own image, blessed before it was given any task at all, and called, along with everything else standing in that finished garden, very good. The voice that spoke light into the darkness on the first page of Genesis is the same voice John says was there in the beginning, still speaking, still making all things new. 6 days. That is all it took. A voice speaking over nothing, and by the end of it, a world with light in its sky, water in its seas, green across its hills, and 2 people standing inside a garden, bearing the very image of the one who made them. Very good, spoken over all of it, before a single day of history had even begun.